KTAR News presents Eyes on Immigration.
I'm Martha Maurer with KTAR News. Today I'm joined by Ybarra Maldonado. He is an immigration attorney here in Phoenix with the Ybarra Maldonado Law Group. And we wanted to have a conversation about the situation that's happening today at the border. The so-called zero tolerance policy by the Trump administration and the separation of families that has led to about 2,300 kids being separated from their families. So, Ray, let's talk about how we got to this point. You know, we have a situation where we've seen heartfelt images of children, audio recordings of kids crying inside detention centers because they're not with their parents. And we're talking about cases where families have come through the border, mainly through Mexico, and have been detained and then have been separated from one another, created what many call a crisis. So talk to us about how we got to this point. Maybe we step back a little bit as to, has this been a policy that's been implemented in the U.S. all along?
Right. So I do immigration and criminal work and have been seeing this issue develop. And in fact, when President Trump made his executive orders when he first came into office, I was on national TV on CNN saying, this is an attack on immigrants. It's an attack on our community. And never did I think it would get to this point. I mean, I was saying back then this is like a full-on attack and a war on immigrants, but I never thought we'd get to this day that what we're seeing right now.
So what are we seeing? What's the law saying that allows for this to happen?
What we're seeing is a zero tolerance policy. That's the problem here. The issue is Attorney General Sessions issued this policy and said, we want to prosecute every single person that comes across the border without inspection. Now there's two federal statutes that come into play here. One's illegal reentry, 8 U.S.C. 1326. The other is a misdemeanor, 8 U.S.C. 1325. So it is a misdemeanor to cross at a place other than a port of entry. So when you cross at a place other than a port of entry, you then can be federally prosecuted. Historically, those have been the two biggest charged crimes in federal courthouses. But there's never been a zero tolerance policy where every single person that comes across the border is supposed to be prosecuted.
So border agents who either catch a person in between ports of entries or at ports of entries, do they have the discretion to say, okay, this person is going to be referred for criminal prosecution or not?
They used to. And then that was the point, right? They used to have the discretion, and then the policy comes out that says zero tolerance. We're taking away the discretionary authority from you, Border Patrol agent. We want 100% of the cases referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office. U.S. Attorney's Office, we want you to prosecute 100% of the cases. So it's Washington, D.C. coming into the local government, the U.S. attorneys and the Border Patrol agents on the ground and saying, we know better than you. We're going to change your policy, and that's resulting in the parents being separated. Because if you come across and you have your kids with you, but there's 100% policy of prosecutions, then the parents go to be prosecuted and the kids get separated and sent to shelters where they cry at night, like these audios that we hear that are absolutely horrific. So that's the change that we've seen in the last couple months.
Now, I've heard a few reports that up until this point, immigration crimes such as crossing the border illegally haven't been considered per se as a crime. It's a civil offense to be in the U.S. without legal authorization, but with this policy it essentially creates a criminal case, which is leading to then the separation. Is that a good way to put it?
It is. It's a little bit more nuanced than that because the criminalization of immigration has been occurring in this country slowly seeping into society. So my background before I had my own office, I was an assistant federal public defender. So all I did was represent people who were charged with these federal crimes down in Tucson. So we even had back then a lot of illegal reentry prosecutions. We had Operation Streamline back then, which we still have in Tucson, where they're prosecuting people for these illegal entry cases. But back then it was 70 people a day that they want to prosecute. Now they're trying to prosecute hundreds, if not thousands per day. So that's the big change. It wasn't just Trump starting, we're going to start this new, enforcing these new laws. It's we're going to have a zero tolerance policy where we enforce the law on every single person that comes across the border without taking discretion into mind.
Now, if we actually step into it a little bit more, you mentioned hundreds and hundreds of cases. What does this do to the system? Because you represent clients in many types of immigration cases. Could this large amount of prosecutions now hinder cases in other areas, such as the ones that you're helping to defend?
Yeah, I mean, it clogs up the system. It takes up the time of federal prosecutors, federal defenders, and federal judges who should be doing more important things. This is the federal government who should be focused on violent, dangerous crimes to keeping the country safe, and instead all these resources are going to prosecute poor people who are fleeing from situations of violence in their country of origin. So the policy is absolutely unbelievably harmful, not just to these individuals, but also to those of us that are here, because we're not being protected from what might truly be crimes.
Now, we hear that the majority of the people that are coming with their families, they're fleeing violence in their own country, situations where if they feel that if they do stay, something's going to happen to their families, they're going to end up dead or something terrible, so they're seeking asylum.
Right.
However, we've heard from the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirsten Nielsen that says, but people are not getting to a port of entry. But then we've heard that once they get to a port of entry, they get turned away. General Jeff Sessions also this week saying, we cannot just allow everyone to come. We don't have open borders. We need to be able to prosecute those who are coming, and not all asylum cases are actually true. So can you talk about what an asylum case is? I know that you're very familiar with that procedure.
Yeah.
Explain to us how difficult it is to actually seek for asylum, and what is the process for somebody to be successful in getting an asylum case?
Sure. So if someone wants to come to the port of entry and ask for asylum, in the past they were able just to walk to the port of entry, and I've done this before. I've gone in Nogales, Sonora with my asylum packet and walked down the line to a customs officer and said, here's the asylum packet, my client's asking for asylum. That was very easy to do a couple of years ago. Now, if we try to do the same thing, they're going to stop us and say, no, you can't come in here. We don't have enough resources to take everybody in. So there are literally homeless people, because they're standing at the port of entry waiting for an opportunity to come in and ask for asylum. And when you see in the executive order, the President Trump says, come to the port of entry and ask for asylum, they're trying to and they can't. So how it's supposed to work, you're supposed to be able to come to the port of entry, ask for asylum, and then the officers have two options. One, they can refer you for a credible fear interview, so a trained asylum officer can determine whether or not you have a credible fear. Or two, they're supposed to just put you in immigration proceedings to someday see a judge. That, unfortunately, is where we're getting bottlenecked, and people aren't getting allowed to come in and present their claims of asylum. Therefore, if you're hungry, if you're afraid, if you have your kids with you, some people are saying they're not letting me in the port of entry, so I'm going to just cross wherever, and the first person I see ask for asylum. Those individuals are the ones that are being prosecuted. They can't come in. They block the front door, so they try to go around and still ask for asylum, yet they're still being prosecuted for illegally coming into the country.
We know that most of these cases are actually people not from Mexico, that they're coming from Central America. One of the biggest questions that I've received as a journalist is, how come immigrants are not seeking asylum per se in Mexico first?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to that question? Do you have an answer as to why make all the way, a very dangerous trip, a very long trip, sometimes with dangerous individuals who may take advantage of these immigrants, and why not go through the process in Mexico first? What do you know about that?
My experience with that, talking to individuals who come applying for asylum, is essentially the understanding that the United States of America is the place where you can receive protection, is the place to not be afraid of your government, is the place to not think that you're going to be robbed or extorted by local officials. So that's why they try to come here. Getting through Mexico or living in Mexico as a Central American is extremely difficult. You will go through a process where everybody's trying to take advantage of you, everybody's trying to get bribes from you, and everybody's threatened to deport you back to your own country of origin. So it is not safe in Mexico for these individuals. That's why they try to come all the way to the United States of America.
Okay, so now going back to what's happening right now. So before we get into the last few days, we saw again the separation of families, because you mentioned there's a lot of people that try to go through the ports of entry. They're not being allowed in. They're choosing to go around through the areas in between the ports. They're getting detained. So what happens when they're detained at the border? At this point, it looks like they're simply being split apart. Where do the adults go? Where do the children go?
So in Arizona, when you cross at a place other than port of entry and they want to bring a prosecution against you, the adults are taken up to Tucson and processed in federal court in Tucson. They're technically in the U.S. Marshal custody. the kids would then be sent to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, and placed in these makeshift tents that we're seeing now, and eventually shelters, and perhaps eventually foster care. So they're essentially creating this legal category of an unaccompanied minor because they're taking the parents away, putting them in criminal proceedings, leaving the kid as an unaccompanied minor that needs to be taken care of by Office of Refugee Resettlement.
Now, we know that the unaccompanied minors, we had a surge of kids coming through the border a few years ago. When President Obama was in office, he had to find a place to put all these kids. So
Yeah.
we learned about that. What was it like in his administration when families came together?
So that was a little bit different back then, right? The surge that we called it back then was mainly unaccompanied minors that were coming across, but there were also families that were coming across. What President Obama did was create family detention centers, much like what we saw President Trump asking for the other day, his executive order. Now, the problem with that is that there's a federal case, the Flores decision, which essentially says you have to take the kids' well-being in mind and maximum keep them in a facility like this for 20 days. So at the 20-day mark, if there was two parents, they would usually let mom go with the kids and dad would stay in detention. If there was one parent, then they would let the one parent go with the kids to continue to fight their case. Obama administration tried to keep these people in detention the entire time, but advocates, immigrant rights advocates and attorneys went back to the court in the Flores case and said, no, we got to intervene. And the courts essentially said the same thing, you got your 20 days. So that's what we're seeing now with the new executive order. President Trump wants to indefinitely keep families detained in these new detention centers, which they're trying to build right now. But to do so, he has to get the Flores decision amended. That's part of the order. It's not going to happen. No federal judge is going to say, okay, President Trump, let you keep these families indefinitely detained. So all that's really happening is, at day 21, he's going to come out and say, my hands are tied, like, is the federal judge making me separate these kids from the parents, and we're going to see that continue to happen.
Okay, so if right now kids and their parents are asked to be together, up until this point they had been separated, one of the criticisms that I kept hearing is, well, these families are coming here undocumented. Sometimes they're not going through the ports of entry, so they're entering, they're being detained and they're being prosecuted. But what difference is there? And they gave me this, I've heard this analogy a lot, I'm sure you have too. Say here in the valley, somebody is caught drunk driving, a U.S. citizen, and has a child in the back seat. That person goes to jail, the child does not go to jail with them. They go to family services if they can't find somebody to place them with. That criticism has come up a lot because they say, what's the difference between immigrants who don't have any ties to the U.S. and they have to be split up, and now they're being forced to be put back together in detention centers for families? Yeah. What would you say to that criticism?
Well, I think there's a huge difference. You have to look at the underlying motive of the people, right? These individuals are coming to escape violence and poverty in their country of origin. They're coming for a better life, for a better future. And from the moral perspective, they are doing everything right. If I'm a parent and there's no opportunity for my kids where I'm at, and worse than that, they're in the fear of dying because of how much danger it's happened, because of the gangs that are extorting people and leaving people dead on the side of the road, morally, what should you do as a parent? Should you take your kid to a better place where they're going to be able to eat, where they're going to be able to live, where they're going to be able to have somewhat of a safe and normal life, or would you keep them there in danger? Whereas you contrast that with the DUI, someone who goes and decides to get drunk and put a kid in the car, morally we're in a quite different situation here. So I don't think the analogy holds true. Not to throw people who get DUIs under the bus, because I do criminal law too, and there's a lot of reasons why people would drink alcohol or abuse alcohol, but nonetheless we have to look at the motive for coming across. It's for a better life for your child, not to put your child in a worse situation.
And that's what perhaps, a lot of people say this is what has led to the president to intervene in a way to pull back the curtains on that zero tolerance and say, okay, at least for now, we're going to hold the families together. But you were saying this executive order is not going to allow for that to happen indefinitely. There's a timeline, a timetable of 20 days that families can be put together. So what's next now? What can happen, first of all, in these 20 days that could potentially change the outcome on day 21?
So the good thing that we've seen so far is that the Border Patrol has said we're not going to refer people over until we can get the housing set up, essentially. So they're kind of pausing the zero tolerance policy for now until they can build up these family detention centers. Then we'll see it come back again. So I think there's a lot of time now to put pressure to end the zero tolerance policy altogether, as opposed to creating more family detention centers where people can be housed during their criminal charges. So I think we're going to see a big pushback there to try to stop the zero tolerance policy. If that doesn't succeed and it goes into play and Border Patrol again starts prosecuting people, we're also calling on the U.S. Attorney's Office to stop prosecuting cases, because they can say to Sessions, we don't want to separate these kids, just like we've seen United Airlines, Southwest, these other businesses take a moral stance and say we're not going to participate in the separation of kids. The U.S. Attorney's Office can also decide we're not going to prosecute those cases and decline to prosecute. So we hope that happens. In the reality, what's probably going to happen, they're going to build the facilities, they're going to have the families in there, but at day 20, it's going to be a battle between the courts and Trump if the kids can stay inside with their parents, or if they must release the kids and keep the family separated.
But either way, until cases of asylum or the process plays out, families are now in the U.S. and they go through an immigration process that we all know can take years in many cases, and it clogs up the system even more. So is this where Congress comes in to find a solution? You know, we've all heard about the issues that Congress itself has, because there were two bills recently that not a lot of people agreed with. One of them was dead on arrival, essentially. The other one has now been postponed.
Right.
So is this where Congress steps in to make a change?
Definitely. I think we need to see that. Immigration reform is long overdue. For years and years we've been talking about the issue, the situation with DACA, now situation with the families that are coming across the border. We need to be able to free up the court resources to adequately address these individuals' cases, give them their day in court. By passing an immigration reform, I think that would take away a lot of the backlog that we're seeing right now. And I'm a fan of giving more resources to immigration judges so that they can actually do their jobs, as opposed to having this tremendous, huge caseload that they can't actually get through the cases. So hopefully we see that as well. But at the end of the day, we really need to also stop the criminalization of migration. We have to relook at it and say, how are we criminalizing people who are coming across the border looking for a better life for themselves or escaping violence? So I think that's the bigger issue that we need to also be talking about.
However, we also hear the argument that when you don't criminalize and when you allow families to stay in, more come behind them, and you're going to see an influx of more people heading to the border. Can the U.S., both Border Patrol and ICE, handle a potential increase in families and even young kids coming on their own for a better life when it's already a very bogged down system?
Yeah, I think there's this narrative out there that we don't have any more room, we don't have any more space, we don't have any more jobs, but I just don't see the reality behind that. When we're looking at a service-based economy like the United States of America is, we need that service industry to be supplied with laborers. And we're looking for people to work in the farms, we're looking for people to work in the hotel industry, we're looking for people to continue to grow our economy. There's not just a set amount of jobs that we have in the country. Once those jobs are taken, there's no more jobs left. As more people come in, more jobs get created, and the economy continues to grow. So this notion that we're out of space right now, I just completely flat out don't agree with it.
Do we have several centers in Arizona? Can you talk a little bit about both the detention centers for families and those shelters for the kids that we have in our state that are stepping in to house these kids while their process goes out?
So we have Southwest Keys facilities here in Arizona that house the children. We don't have any family detention centers, those are in Texas. But to me, those aren't the solution. The solution is to stop being so focused on detention. Why can't we, in the 21st century, look for a different way to make sure people are going to show up at their court hearings, release them, ensure they show up at their court hearings, have their due process, have their day in court, and then decide what to do with their cases. There's no reason that children have to be separated from their families. There's no reason that families have to be detained. If they're not posing a danger to anybody and they're here seeking asylum, let them have their day in court and let them be free while they're going after that process.
How long could an asylum case take?
Asylum cases vary depending a lot on jurisdiction too. I've done asylum cases as far as New York, to California, and a lot of places in between. In Arizona, in front of an immigration judge, it could be 2 or 3 years fighting your asylum case. In somewhere like Upstate New York, it could be a matter of 8 months before you have an answer. So it's all about the jurisdiction and how many cases that they have there.
Finally, with Congress perhaps being a possible solution if some sort of immigration bill gets passed, whether it's complete reform or not, one thing that we know the president has asked time and time again is money for his border wall. Could money for a border wall and more items for more money for judges and for border agents, could that essentially work? Or if you were able to create your own bill and present it to the president, knowing that he's going to want money for the wall, what would that bill look like to possibly have a real solution to the problem?
Well, I think the first thing is we can't just automatically say you deserve your border wall for giving us something. They're two separate issues. He wants a border wall for his ego and to deliver to his base a promise that he made, but there's not good policy behind it. So we shouldn't succumb and say, okay, because we need good policy, we're going to give you a bad policy that wastes billions of dollars. I think we need to continue to push back and say we're not okay with that. We do need a bill, but I think we need standalone bills that address these issues. DACA needs a standalone bill, the DREAM Act, a clean DREAM Act, to vote up and down on whether or not these kids or these young people should have a way to stay in the country. The issue of the kids at the border and the family separation needs a standalone bill on its own to deal with that issue. There's no reason that he should be using children as bargaining chips in an effort to get his wall.
Now, with the kids that have already been separated and perhaps with parents that have already been deported, what's the next step for them in trying to get them reunited?
So we've seen so far a lawsuit filed, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, against the federal government to try to get the family united, and pretty quickly we saw that mom and kid being put back together. So I think there needs to be an effort from attorneys like myself and everybody else here in Arizona to look for those cases and file those lawsuits to get those parents reunited. It's clear that the federal government was oblivious when they implemented this zero tolerance policy and just completely dehumanized the kids and parents and didn't keep good track of who was going where. And hey, at the end of this, how are we going to reunite everybody? That wasn't put into play. So there's no way that this policy should go back into effect without having that game plan in the back or at the forefront of how are we going to make sure these kids stay together. From the very beginning, you keep them together. That solves that problem. So that's the easiest way. But also now that there's kids essentially lost and parents don't know where their kids in, it's time for attorneys to step up and file lawsuits. It's also time for community members to step up and do what they've been doing. We've seen a lot of actions across the country in front of ICE buildings directed directly at the Department of Homeland Security director, calling them out for doing these processes. We need to see a lot more of those taking place so we can make sure these kids are reunited.
Well, this week was full of developments. Again, the president signed an executive order to stop the families from being separated and then instead house them in detention centers together as a family. Then we had Congress, who had two GOP-backed bills, one of them that died right as they voted on it, and another one that has now been postponed until next week. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens next week, if any at all solution will be put forth in front of Congress, and then the next hurdle will be the U.S. Senate. In the meantime, there's a clock ticking of less than a month in which families can be held in these detention centers. Thank you, Ray, for your time and your expertise. Is there anything else that you think it's important for the community of Arizona as a whole to understand about this issue?
Yeah, I think we have kind of been in a simmering pot for these past couple of decades, if you will, on the anti-immigrant issue. It's kind of gotten worse and worse and slowly getting worse. And it's at the point now where a lot of my friends, a lot of my family are really in a deep depression. It's like, man, how much more can we get attacked? How much more can they do against our community? And we're also seeing that start to permeate within our everyday lives. When the government takes such bold actions against people, it sends a message to the general public that it's okay to look down at people who are brown because they might be Mexican. It's okay to humiliate them. It's okay to have these microaggressions. So I would call on the community, us, to stand up for ourselves, to have pride in who we are and who our ancestors were and where we came from, and at the same time to have the rest of the community realize this is a moral issue. And we can't allow the federal government doing these things to the kids to affect our day-to-day lives and demonize those who are our neighbors and who are part of our community. We are one Arizona. We need to remain united. We need to take a moral stand against what's happening in our own backyard.
Thank you. And it's also an issue that's going to continue until there is some action across the country when it comes to immigration. We'll have to wait to see what happens with the president and with Congress and what's going to happen with these families that at this point are just waiting to see what's next in their cases. I'm Martha Maurer with the KTAR Newsroom. Thank you for watching.
I'm Bob McClay. Here's our top story.